Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and I am here to kick off one of two videos that are sort of a celebration of me being on BookTube for 5 years. The video that will be coming, which I haven't filmed yet, hopefully it will be ready before the end of the year, will have a little bit more reflection about what life has been like being on BookTube, how it's changed my life as a reader, and things like that. But I thought it would be fun, along with that, to look back at some of my favorite books since I have been on BookTube. So that's what I'm going to do. And what I have done is I've gone back to my favorite books of each year that I have been on BookTube, and I have picked them from there. It's a little complicated because basically my very first video that I posted on BookTube was December 29th, 2018. So technically 2018 is the year where I started my channel, but I count it as 2019 because December 29th. Come on. I think I did publish a video about my favorite books of 2018 like on December 30th, but yeah, I count 2019. The benefit of that situation is that I haven't filmed a favorite books of 2023 video yet, and I won't do that until the end of the year officially, because to me, it doesn't really make sense to finish your year when you're still reading within that calendar year. For instance, I'm reading a book right now that could crack into my top 5 if it sticks the landing, and it's December 21st. So it's not over until it's over. So you'll have my December or my 2023 best reads at the beginning of January. But because one of my first 2 videos was my favorite reads of 2018, I do have 5 sets of favorite books to look at and review. And my original thought was that I could rank all of them. However, when I started pulling all of the titles so I could, get them and hold them up as I talk about them, I started thinking to myself, a ranking is going to be absolutely impossible. I could try to sit down with this list for days and not really get it figured out. So I decided not to do a ranking. I will pick a top 5 at the end of the video, and I will pick an overall favorite from my favorite reads of the last 5 years, but I'm not going to do a ranking. That would have driven me absolutely mad and insane. So I had to just let that go. I will also note that we are starting with the oldest favorites. So we're going to start with my earlier videos because I figured it would be interesting to see some of the books I don't talk about as much on my channel, because once you get to the newer ones, I still talk about those books a fair amount. And I will have links to the original videos in the description box down below if you'd like to go back. And again, the older ones are a little messy, but it is what it is. Hopefully I've gotten better over the course of 5 years. I will also have links to each of these books on bookshop.org down below. These are affiliate links. So if you are inspired to check any of them out, that would help me out if you use those links. Otherwise, I would encourage you to check out your local independent bookstore and support them. I am a huge supporter of independent bookstores. So if you do that, it would make me happy. You can also support your local library. That is a great thing that you can do as well. But there will be links to these titles and the original videos in the description box down below. So feel free to check that out or ignore it completely. That's fine. So as I said, we are going to start with 2018. Now, this was interesting because, like I said, this was my second video. I hadn't quite found a rhythm for how things were going to go. I hadn't figured out the way I like to do things yet. So in this instance, I picked one favorite book, and all of the other books that I talk about in that video are unranked. So I only really had one book to pick from that one. And then in 2019, I kind of did a similar thing. I only picked 2 favorites, one runner-up and one favorite, and then the rest were unranked. So then starting in 2020, I did a more proper top 10 or top 20. And in those instances, I just chose the top 5 out of there. But for 2018 and 2019, I don't have that many books. It's fine. So it's also interesting, just as a quick note, I bragged in the 2018 video that I had read 56 books that year and how it was an all-time high for me. And one of the impacts of having been on BookTube, which I will talk about when I do that other video, is that my reading has doubled since then. So it's kind of adorable to see me say, I read 56 books and that's an all-time high for me. And now it's much higher than that. So which book was my favorite in 2018, since I only selected one favorite? It was The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai. And spoiler alert for the whole video, there is not a single book on this list that I am second guessing naming as a favorite. And the same is true of this one. And I was on a huge high with this book at the time. I will say I do have a complaint with it, which is that there are multiple storylines in this book. And at least one of them doesn't work or is significantly less interesting than the others. So that is something you sort of have to take with a grain of salt. Overall, I can see why that storyline is there, and I think it does add a level of resonance to the conclusion of the book, which ultimately is about trauma and how trauma repeats over generations, and the ways in which people deal with that. And of course, that is something that I find immediately interesting. It's, that sense of generational trauma, or the ways in which things that happen have a ripple effect moving forward. I find that absolutely fascinating. And I think the book gets at that really well. But in order to do that, it needs those different timelines and storylines. And when I say timelines, I just mean that there is a part of the book set in the 1980s, a part of the book set closer to the present, and then in the 1980s portion, there is a character who doesn't send you back to World War I, but does have a lot of reflections about World War I. So you get this sense of generational loss and trauma. And the focus of the book in the 1980s is about the AIDS epidemic hitting Chicago, and centers on a group of gay friends who are falling prey, and you don't know how many of them, if any, will still be alive in the present day storyline. Great book. I would absolutely recommend it. I do have that one little caveat that one of the storylines is less successful than the others. However, it really does hammer in the overall theme of the book. And the one that I would say doesn't work as well is the one that's closer to the present. However, you need that because it hammers in that sense of generational trauma and the ripple effect that these traumas have over time, because you need to see the effect of what happens in the 80s today. So I still appreciate it, even though I think it's a weaker aspect of the story. And I think for that reason, when I was thinking about a ranking, I admit I did kind of think to myself, well, The Great Believers would be at the bottom. But then when I looked at the rest of them, it was a little bit too difficult to figure it out. And I don't tell you that to dunk on the book. I still recommend it. I still think it's a great book, but I think because of that flaw, it would probably be the weakest of a set of fantastic books. However, it is still a great book that is well worth your time to read and explore further. So that was my 2018 book. Let's move to 2019, where I picked two books, one runner-up and one favorite. And in each of these cases where I have more than one book to talk about, we're going to do a kind of like a countdown. We're going to work our way up to the number one. So my runner-up in 2019 was A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry. A chunky little monkey that flows beautifully and effortlessly. I was captivated by this book. I had been wanting to read it for a very long time, and I was glad that I finally got around to it. And I will say, in the time since I read it, good portions of the plot have faded from my memory. However, that doesn't indicate to me a sign of anything bad in the book. To me, that is almost exciting, because part of me thinks, oh, I can reread this book and discover it all over again, because I think that would be a lot of fun. And, I think a part of that just comes down to how big the book is. It's a little bit sprawling. I've heard it described as sort of Dickensian, which is kind of interesting, but this is set in 1975 in India, and it's about people surviving the political turmoil of the time. And it is a captivating, fascinating book. And like I said, if details of it have faded from my memory over time, I really don't fault the book for that. It's kind of my problem anyway. But there are other books that are fresher in my memory. But really, to me, that just says that this would be a great book to reread. And it would almost be like reading it again for the first time. But I do remember a lot of things about this book. There are just certain specifics and plot points and characters that somebody was talking about this book recently, and I watched it and I was like, I don't remember that. But I would love to go back and reread this book and enjoy it all over again. That's how much I liked it. And this was a very tough call at different points throughout 2019. The top two books kept switching back and forth. Ultimately, I placed this at number 2, and I do think that was ultimately correct. but A Fine Balance by Hinton Mystery is an absolutely fantastic book, and I would highly recommend it to you. And again, it is set in India in 1975. It is about the political turmoil that was going on at the time, and characters who are caught up in it and trying to survive. And it's about friendship and love in times of trouble. It's a really great book. I think we can all relate to times of trouble right now. The book that I selected as my favorite, which I do stand by, is A Place for Us by Fatima Farheen Mirza. An absolutely beautiful, stunning story about a fractured family. The inciting incident that you hear about in this book when you read the blurb is that an estranged brother has been invited to his sister's wedding, and he agrees to go. And that is sort of the linchpin of the book. That's what sets things in motion. But what's really interesting is that it moves backwards and forwards in time to tell you the story of how this family got to this point where the brother is so estranged, and there are so many fractures in the family. And I think what is really great about it as well is that so often when you're crafting a narrative, you rely on shorthand and you rely on big moments. So it would be really tempting to have a really obvious big moment that sort of says, like, this is the moment where the family fractured and where things had gone too far. They crossed the point of no return. And Fatima Farheen Mirza understands that it's not always like that. This is a family that has a lot of small fractures over time, and misunderstandings and arguments and things that go unsatisfied and aren't settled over time. And when they are allowed to settle in, suddenly the foundation is really bad. You have a lot of small cracks and fissures and fractures that cause the entire foundation of a house to be unstable. And that's what happens to this family. And it also shifts perspective. Sometimes you get the same incident told to you, and then in a subsequent section from a different family member, you will hear it again. And it really alters your perception of what happened and what was going on, and everyone's understanding of what happened as well. And the last section of the book really, it just made me sob. I sobbed my way through it. It is a beautiful book. It really hit me. And this is a story about a Muslim family, and it resonated with me so profoundly. And I still think about this book all the time. It is usually sitting over my shoulder right here whenever I film a video, and I love being able to see it right there. It's just, I had to pull it down, so I temporarily faced out something else, but I absolutely love this book. I listened to it on audio, and I needed to have a copy of it for my shelf. So I searched for one and found a hardcover at my local used bookstore, and I'm so glad that I have it. And I would actually love to reread this book, but it's settled into my soul, and I still think about this book all the time. And not just because it tends to be over my shoulder when I film a video. So let's move to 2020. 2020 was a ridiculously stacked year. The top 3 in particular is insane. It's ludicrous that I read so many good books in one year. It was so difficult to choose between them then, and even now I sort of struggle. Well, the number 1 is kind of obvious, but the top 3 in particular is really strong. But this is a case where I have a top 5 that I pulled, and the number 5 was Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi, and this is a book I still love. This had been shortlisted for the Booker Prize, ultimately did not win. I believe what I said about this book at the time was that it was like a delicious poison, and I still think that's true. This is about a toxic relationship between a mother and a daughter, and it can be very uncomfortable to read. For that, it is a very prickly book, not just on the beautiful cover, which I got from the UK. I think it looks different in the US, but I'm glad I have this cover because I just think it's absolutely stunning. I think it also was originally published under a different name, and I don't remember what it was. But this is a tremendous book. I absolutely loved it. And this is another one where I remember the broad strokes of the book, but some of the minor details have fled from me over time. But I still remember the power that this book had over me. It is about an unsatisfying relationship between a mother and daughter, but it's also about the frailties of memory, how you can misremember things, how you can misunderstand things. And the roles have reversed the mother was never really a proper caregiver for her daughter, but now she is beginning to suffer from dementia, or the daughter thinks she's suffering from dementia. And the daughter is forced to be a caregiver for a woman who has never been a proper caregiver for her. And she is bitter and angry about that. And it's a great book. And I stand by its place in the top 5. Absolutely a fantastic read. Number 4 was Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, which could, Burnt Sugar could have been number 1 in any other year. Lonesome Dove could have been number 1 at any other time. Lonesome Dove ended up being the first book that I read for my Pulitzer Prize project. I had already read a lot of Pulitzer Prize winners by the time I decided to do my project, where I am reading all of the Pulitzer Prize winners for fiction, but this ended up being the first one. I had originally planned to read the very first winner and kind of got away from that and read it in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. So I very slowly worked my way through it. However, it is a very powerful book, and it's another chunky little monkey. But Larry McMurtry is such a good storyteller that, to me, this book just flows when there's not a global pandemic causing shutdowns and lockdowns in your country. I have heard some criticism of this book. I think what Larry McMurtry is doing is so subtle that you can read this book and just think it's a great, entertaining Western, which some people see as a flaw. I think it's great that you can take it as an entertainment, but if you really take the time to think about what it is and what is being said and what is happening, there is so much meaning coursing underneath the surface. And I think it's absolutely beautiful. I love the way it calls into question the myth-making of the American West. And, of course, the American West sort of being a stand-in for America itself. And I have a whole deep dive about Lonesome Dove because it was one of the books for my Pulitzer Prize project. So I will have links to that one, and there will be more Pulitzer books in here that I have deep dives on. I'll tell you when they come up, but this is one of them. There will be a full video down below. Absolutely a wonderful book. I know Larry McMurtry later wrote a prequel and some sequels, and I admit I have no interest in continuing the series. I think this is a pretty perfect encapsulation of the story of two ranchers who decide to move up to Montana from where they are on the border of Mexico and Texas, and everything that happens. There are some shocking deaths that happen pretty quickly in this book. There is some violence, and there's a section on a river that I will never forget. It just kind of haunts my dreams, and I won't say anything more about it. But yeah, fantastic book, and I do really want to read other books by Larry McMurtry. I have Terms of Endearment, and I have The Last Picture Show, and I really want to read The Last Picture Show. So he's an author I would definitely explore more in the future. Now we get to the top 3, and it is ludicrous that I read all 3 of these in the same year. What a just overflowing fountain of fantastic reads. It seems weird that Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell came in 3rd place, given how much I love this book, because it's really great. It's fantastic. It won the Women's Prize, and you're probably familiar with it. But basically, this is the story of the wife of Shakespeare. Shakespeare is never actually named. You know who he is, but he's never named. And oddly, it does name other people in his family, so you do get the Shakespeare name, just not when it comes to him. And it's about the death of their son, which is not a spoiler because it's the entire purpose of the book, and how that... It's not really about how that inspired Shakespeare to write Hamlet, but it is a story about Shakespeare's wife and her grief. And she's such a fascinating, quirky character. There are passages from this book that I think I will always remember. Like there's a section where she's in a shed full of apples with William Shakespeare. And I have heard some criticism of this book where people say it's supposed to be about the son dying, and the son doesn't die until you're more than halfway through the book. But to me, the fact that you know that is going to happen really just creates a sense of suspense as you go through the book. And to me, it was even sadder by the time it happens, because you have spent so much time with the characters and you know what this means to them. And such a good book. I absolutely love it. And the way it's about the marriage without even really being about Shakespeare, I really appreciate the way it gives her story to her. And it's so good. It's so good. Coming in at number 2 was Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart, which is another book I absolutely loved. Again, it's ludicrous that I read these 3 books in the same year. this ended up winning the Booker Prize. And this is another one that really powerfully resonated with me, even though I didn't grow up in Glasgow at the time that Douglas Stewart did. But it is sort of inspired by his childhood and his own mother, who was an alcoholic, and I almost gave something away. I won't. And it really resonated with me because I grew up with an alcoholic mother. And one thing that's really difficult to explain to people when you do talk about your childhood in that regard is that I loved my mother. And I was very dedicated and devoted to her for a long time. And it was only later that I started thinking about a lot of the toxic things that were going on and the ways in which that harmed me. And Shuggie Bain has a palpable love for his mother, and he supports her, he stands by her, and tries to hold her up and prop her up, even though there's no way he can actually do that. So this book deals with an experience that I had that is really difficult to explain to people a lot of the time, and I really appreciated it for that. I also think it's just a great book, and a very empathetic book, and a very intelligent book. Difficult, for sure. Lots of triggers as Shuggie deals with his alcoholic mother and faces abuse for being a sort of effeminate child. And there is sexual assault in here. There's a lot that is difficult about this book, but it is also beautiful and empathetic and hopeful. And those are things that I am finding a lot through being on BookTube for as long as I have now, that I really appreciate and prize in books when I find them. So it's just a great, wonderful book. But there could only be one favorite that year, and I went with Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, and I stand by it. It is such a good book. Toni Morrison can be a very difficult writer, and when I say that, I mean she really wants you to be an active reader. She wants you to figure out some of the stuff that's happening and what the meaning behind some of the things. This is a book where, in my edition, there is a foreword that explains how the opening sentence of this book, every single word of that sentence is deliberate and intentional and has meaning to the book. And that opening sentence is, the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance agent promised to fly from Mercy to the other side of Lake Superior at 3:00. Read the foreword to understand the meaning behind it. But like, that is, I did this as a buddy read, and we went sort of chapter by chapter, and that definitely helped me with it. But it's such a beautiful, meaningful, gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous book. I think it is my personal choice for my favorite Toni Morrison novel. It's just so good. So even with stiff competition from Shuggie Bain and Hamnet, I think it was always going to be Song of Solomon, and I still stand by that decision. I do not regret it in any way after all this time. After all this time, it hasn't been that long, but you know what I mean. So now let us go to 2021 and my favorite books from that year. And again, we're going to go in reverse order. So we're going to start with number 5, which was The Rain Heron by Robbie Arnott. Interestingly, I think of all the books that we're going to talk about, this is one of the ones that I recommend to people the most. So it's kind of funny that it came in 5th for the year in which I read it. But this is a wonderful, wonderful story. It flirts with sci-fi fantasy and a little bit of mythology, which is not something I typically read. And by the way, let's have a moment for how gorgeous and stunning the cover of this book is. That's actually one of the things that drew me to it first. I was doing the Montana Book Company Reading Challenge, and one of the prompts was choose a book by its cover. And then when Charlie from Montana Book Company explained the premise of the book, I was sold even more. So you have a woman who is living sort of on the fringes of society in the mountains in this future where it's kind of dystopian, but not, I hesitate to use the word because it doesn't lean into that. You don't really know or understand what has gone on in the wider world that has led society to fracture a little bit. There's a very militaristic quality to it. But anyway, this woman has sort of separated herself from society, and then her life is changed because another woman who is running a military group shows up, and she wants this woman to help her find the mythical rain heron. And I think that is really all you need. The way the story spins out from there is stunning. I have recommended this book to so many people, and I have not had one person come back and tell me that they did not like it. It's so good. It's so good. I've gifted this book to a lot of people over the years. It's just so good. And again, because it is something that I recommend all the time, it's kind of funny to go back and realize that it was my 5th place finisher for the year in which I read it. But it is really, truly a remarkable book, and I would recommend it to you if you have not read it. Number 4 was The Yield by Tara June Lynch, and I really struggled, I remember, with where to put this on the list because I loved this book. I had a very profound reading of it. It reminded me of experiences that my foster son, who is Native, had here in the United States, although this is set in Australia and deals with Indigenous life in Australia. This is something I did as a buddy read with Sean the Book Maniac. Such a good book. Such a good book. It is about theft of culture, and it is about the sort of genocidal treatment of Indigenous groups in Australia and in the United States. Well, it deals heavily with Australia exclusively, but it's easy to read this as someone who is American and see parallels to what has happened here. It's told in 3 different storylines. There's a woman who is returned to her family home. There are entries in a dictionary, and there are letters as well. And the stories that it put together are the stories of how their culture has been taken from them and continues to be taken from them. And it's so good. It's so good. And again, it's kind of astonishing that this came in 4th place, given just how good it ultimately is. Coming in 3rd was Like a Love Story by Abdi Nazemian, another book that I have recommended a fair amount. And I read Only This Beautiful Moment by Abdi Nazemian this year, and it just affirmed what a great and powerful writer he is. This is set in the late 1980s, has teenagers who are coming of age during the AIDS epidemic and also facing activism. They have a burgeoning sexuality at this time because they're teenagers, but they are also afraid of that sexuality and what it might mean for them. And this is a time when their sexuality seemed dangerous because of things that were going on in the wider world. And at the same time, they are discovering a sense of activism and standing up for themselves and their rights as human beings. And it's beautiful. And it deals with a love triangle. You have a girl who is interested in a boy who is actually more interested in her male friend, who is very gay and outspoken. And the story spins out from there. So good. It's absolutely good. 2nd place was Aristotle and Dante Dive into the Waters of the World. And I did struggle a great deal because I think I had a very emotional reaction to this book. And that's something I deal with a lot when I'm choosing my favorites for the year or overall. Does my personal emotional reaction to a book mean more than my critical sensibility? And I feel like more often than not, I end up thinking as a critic more than I think with my heart. If I were voting with my heart, this would have been my number 1 read of the year. But there was another book that got that spot. This is so good. But really, you need to read this as a companion to Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, which is the first book in the duology. They pair together really well. This actually picks up almost exactly where Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe leaves off. I reread both of these books this year, and they really stand up. There is an element of this book where it is kind of like the best case scenario. And I saw something recently where somebody said all of the good characters act in a very noble and understanding and great ways, and any character you're not supposed to like doesn't. And that is true. And it is sort of like the best case scenario for the way people will act in certain situations. But I really love and need that sense of understanding that maybe that it's possible that people will be understanding and supportive of their children, or that people can find their way in the world, and despite being different, or the stigmas and stereotypes that are working against them. It's such a good book. Such a good book. And it was surprising to me that it was not in my number 1, but The Power of the Dog by Thomas Savage was my number 1. And the surprise was that I read it because I wanted to read it before the film adaptation of it came out. And then I did a book versus movie comparison. I'll link that down below. And as I was working on that video, I really was shocked by how much I actually loved this book. I guess I hadn't really stopped to think about how much I loved it until I sat down and thought about all of the really smart things that go on in here. You probably know exactly what this is because the film adaptation exists. But watch the video. It has spoilers. If you don't want spoilers, just read the book. Just read the book first, because there's so much more in the book. Some of which is a concession that you have to make when you adapt something for the film. You can't really get into the interior lives of the characters, so you have to find ways to express those things, especially when you have a protagonist in this book, who is awful and not communicative. Like, he will never explain why he does the things that he does. So the movie has to find ways to get to explain why he's awful and some of the awful things that he is doing. But there are also plot points that are missing from the movie. This is a fantastic book, and I would absolutely encourage you, read the book. See the movie, but read the book. So, yeah, I still stand by the notion that this was the #1 book that I read that year. But again, if I were voting with my heart, it would have been Aristotle and Dante Dive into the Waters of the World. Let's move to last year, my 2022 reads. And now we get to another book that has a Pulitzer Prize deep dive that will be linked down below, now in November, by Josephine Johnson. This was one of the books that I was curious about when I decided to do my Pulitzer Prize project, because one thing that really intrigues me are the books and authors that have been lost to time. And there are a bunch from the 1930s that fit that bill, and the 1920s, actually. But someone pointed me in the direction of this one because there's an interesting story attached to Josephine Johnson, which is that this was her debut novel, and she won a Pulitzer Prize for it. She is the youngest person to ever win a Pulitzer Prize, and that's unlikely to repeat because she was 26. And it just is unlikely that anyone would ever beat that. However, she published 2 more books, and then her contract with the publisher was canceled, and she had published other books, but ended up fading into obscurity. And the story, basically the idea or the thought is that they were concerned that she was tied to communism or socialism. That time of American history is fraught. Again, go to the video that will be linked down below for full details. But I love this book. It is a very empathetic story about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and it's about a family. It's empathetic. It unfolds in really interesting ways, and I have also read 2 other books by Josephine Johnson since then, Inland Island and 7 Houses, both nonfiction. Now in November has been reprinted, and so has the Inland Island, and I really hope that it leads to a greater appreciation of her work and that more people will discover it, because this is just a really fantastic book, and she's an interesting author with a very interesting story attached to her. Coming in 4th was Matrix by Lauren Groff. I love this book so much. And I read The Vaster Wilds this year, which is taking the spot where Matrix is usually faced out on my shelf, and actually is sort of a spiritual sequel to this. They are not direct sequels, like don't expect the storyline to continue. Matrix is about a girl boss lesbian nun in the 1200s. And The Vaster Wilds is about a young woman who runs away from her American settlement in the 1600s and is in The Vaster Wilds. Go figure. What's linking them is the idea that they are about women in precarious places in history. And I just responded so well to the story. I think it's beautiful. It says a lot about religion and the power of women and how that power has been erased in history. It's so good. It's so good. I love this book. And again, it's surprising to me, given how much I love this book and how much I have recommended this book to people, that it wasn't #1. Coming in #3 was Don't Cry for Me by Daniel Black, another book that, although it's not about me or about people who are like me, it resonated very powerfully with me. This is a book in which a father who is dying of cancer at a relatively young age is writing letters to his estranged son. He has no intention of sending these letters to his son. He wants them to be given to his son after he is already gone, because he has mishandled the relationship with his son. But in these letters, he is sort of explaining why. And what I really appreciate about this book is that he's not asking for sympathy. He's not asking for forgiveness. He's just sort of asking for understanding. Like, these are the things that I was taught. And I was actually a sensitive boy when I was young, but I almost said beaten out of him, but that's a little aggressive. He was taught not to be sensitive. He was taught that he had to be tough. And he tried to do the same thing to his son without realizing that he was perpetuating a sort of toxic idea about what a man is supposed to be in society. And he could never really handle the fact that his son is gay. It is such a good book. And it is about a complicated father-son dynamic, and it is also about forgiveness and the prizing of understanding, and it's so good. Daniel Black told Joel, actually, that he is going to be writing a sequel where the son gets the letters and reacts, and I can't wait for that. I want it in my life right now. This is such a good book. This is an interesting case because, as I said, I typically struggle trying to decide if I should choose a favorite book as a critic or if I should choose with my heart. In 2022, I chose with my heart. So, arguably, Beloved is a better book. Not arguably, I think it's almost factual. Beloved is a fantastic book by Toni Morrison. This is the other Pulitzer book. There will be a deep dive down below. It's such a good book. And it is a complicated and thorny book. It is difficult to read, but it is intended to be difficult to read because Toni Morrison is writing about an enslaved woman and the traumas that she has experienced. And why should that be pleasant? It shouldn't. So this is such a smart book. It is a difficult book to read. Again, I did this as a buddy read, and we did sort of chapter by chapter. And that does help you parse through a lot of the stuff that is happening because it isn't always easy to get the full meaning of what is happening. I reread a bunch of E.M. Forster books this year, and I had been thinking that he was my favorite writer, and I found that he's a lot more uneven. So I'm going to go on a quest and try to find who my favorite author is. And I'm kind of thinking it might be Toni Morrison because, in 2019, because the other books were unranked, I didn't mention that I read The Bluest Eye or Cranford in this video. Cranford's great, by the way, but The Bluest Eye, another absolutely fantastic Toni Morrison book. Incapable of writing a bad book so far. And I read Love, which is head and shoulders above what most authors put out, but for Toni Morrison is probably the weakest one of hers that I've read. What a good book. What an absolute triumph. And I highly recommend it. If you only read one Toni Morrison book in your life, make it Beloved. If you are intimidated, start with The Bluest Eye. That is her debut, and it's a lot easier to parse what's happening. So I mentioned I chose with my heart when I chose my favorite book of 2022, and that was Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And I do stand by it because I had such an emotional reaction to this book. I won't spend a lot of time talking about this one because I do spend a lot of time talking about it. And, I think people are probably tired about it. But this one co-won the Pulitzer Prize this year. I freaked out when that happened. I was so glad that I actually filmed my reaction live as it was happening because it's just funny. It will be linked down below. I love this book. It's another book that really prizes empathy, and it deals with a lot of difficult things. It is an update of David Copperfield, if you're unfamiliar, and it is set in Appalachia in the 90s and early 2000s. And it just deals with so many difficult topics. The pitfalls of the foster system. It deals with drug addiction, deals with opioid epidemic. From both sides. It is critical of the companies that perpetuated it or perpetrated it. It's kind of both. And the people who fell victim to it and the ways Appalachia was taken advantage of. And yet it is a very hopeful book to me. I know there are people who focus on the bad things that happen more than the sense of hope and optimism, but that's what I came away from the book with. A sense of love and hope and empathy. And again, those are things that I have found that I really prize in a book. So that's Demon Copperhead. Now, I mentioned I'm not doing a ranking. It would have been way too difficult. But I did choose a top 5 out of all of these books. And in no particular order, let's just go, no particular order. The first one is A Place for Us by Fatima Farheen Mirza. This is a book that just, as I said, crawled into my soul and lives there. And I love it. I will actually want to reread it at some point because I think it's just such a beautiful story about a family and misunderstandings and the ways we get torn apart and can potentially come together. I love this book. It lives in my soul. Beloved by Toni Morrison. It's just such a good book. Everything you've heard about this being an American classic, potentially the great American novel, is true. It's so good. It is so good. The Power of the Dog by Thomas Savage. I really struggled with this one because it was really difficult to even pick a top 5. Ranking would have been impossible. But what made me put this in the top 5 is that I was on such a high with this book that I immediately ran out and found another book by Thomas Savage. And it was a little more uneven than this, but I still want to read it. And actually, every time I go to my local used bookstore, because Thomas Savage has a Montana connection, every time I look to see if they have like a hardcover copy of the book or a pretty edition of the book, because I want that. And because I want a hardcover or like a nice edition of this book, I'm not a huge fan of this cover, being honest. I think that speaks to how much I love this book, and just the fact that I am keeping an eye out for a nice copy of it. So Power of the Dog made it into my top 5. Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. Again, head and heart. I think we can all agree Beloved is Toni Morrison's masterpiece. But my personal favorite is Song of Solomon. And the final in the top 5, again, this was the last one I added to the top 5, and it's Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stewart. And I think it goes back to the fact that this book speaks to an experience that I had in my childhood and hopefully have overcome over time, and how beautiful it is, even though it deals with a lot of really difficult and sort of thorny topics. Now, picking a best out of that top 5 was also really fraught and difficult and just a lot. I will say I kind of quickly let go of Shuggie Bain and The Power of the Dog. So it was down to Beloved, Song of Solomon, and A Place for Us. And my heart really wanted to vote for A Place for Us. I got stuck in that realm again where it's like, as a critic, these are better. My heart wants to say A Place for Us. And then even when you get down to Toni Morrison, like if I were to put that one aside, which one do I choose? Because this one's my personal favorite, but arguably this one is her masterpiece. So what do you do? What do you do? I don't know how to pick between these 3 books. I can't, and you won't make me. So I'm just going to go with my head on this one and say, arguably, this is the best American book that has ever been published. So if I have to choose a favorite, I'm just going to say Beloved, because I don't want to have to sit and think about and weigh the options, because I love all of these books, but this one is a masterpiece. So I'm just going to go with that. It's interesting because I feel like people are going to comment, and so let me just say, yes, I put Demon Copperhead ahead of Beloved in my ranking for last year, and I stand by that because that was voting with my heart. People have kind of commented like, but you love Demon Copperhead. How when I did my 25 best books of the last 25 years, Demon Copperhead wasn't in there, really because of recency bias. That is something that I was worried about. But a lot of people commented, like, you love that book. How is it not here? I do love that book. Doesn't mean it's my favorite of all time or anything like that. And I am putting Beloved in number 1 really because I think it has to be acknowledged as the great American novel, or like one of the great American novels. I don't think any one book can sum up the American experience. But so, that is a look back at my favorite books. I hope you have been entertained by this. I will have more reflections on 5 years on BookTube to come. I'd love to hear your thoughts about any of these books. Which ones would be your favorite out of them, and recommendations, anything. Let me know in the comments section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.